What if the most devastating confession Prince Harry ever made wasn't delivered at a podium, or written in a memoir, or shouted in anger, but slipped out slowly, almost accidentally, across years of interviews, silences, and emotional pauses? What if the truth didn't arrive as a headline, but as a pattern? Because that's the question people are asking now. Not quietly, not cautiously, but obsessively. Tonight, we're not here to declare guilt. We're not here to present courtroom evidence. We're here to examine something far more unsettling. What happens when public words, private behavior, and long-circulating rumors begin to line up in ways that make even loyal supporters uncomfortable? And it all centers on two names the world cannot stop watching: Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, once framed as the ultimate modern fairy tale, now discussed as one of the most polarizing marriages of our time. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Rumors about this relationship didn't appear overnight. They didn't begin with tabloids desperate for clicks. They didn't even start after the royal exit. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. They started early. They lingered quietly. And they never fully went away. And for years, most people dismissed them. Because love stories are easier to believe than warnings. Think back for a moment. Remember how it all began. The rebellious prince. The outsider actress. Two people supposedly finding freedom in each other while pushing back against a rigid institution. It felt cinematic. It felt emotional. It felt righteous. And anyone who questioned it was quickly labeled cruel, outdated, or biased. But here's where things start to shift. Because in recent years, something subtle but powerful has happened. People have gone back. Back to old interviews. Back to early statements. Back to moments that once sounded romantic, but now feel uneasy. The pauses linger longer. The smiles don't reach the eyes. The wording feels careful. And suddenly, viewers are asking questions they weren't allowed to ask before. What if Harry was telling us more than we realized? What if the cracks were always visible, but we didn't want to see them? This story matters now because public perception is changing. Not because of one explosive quote. Not because of a single leaked recording. But because of accumulation. Years of interviews. Years of strained family relationships. Years of isolation from friends, from tradition, from identity. And one central theme keeps resurfacing: loss. Harry doesn't just speak about losing security. He speaks about losing family, losing connection, losing himself. And here's the part that makes people uneasy. When discussing that loss, his frustration is rarely directed outward anymore. It turns inward. It turns reflective. And sometimes, depending on who's listening, it sounds like regret. Now let's be clear. There is no verified statement where Harry explicitly accuses his wife of infidelity. There is no confirmed admission that she destroyed his family in a literal, factual sense. What exists instead is something more complicated and more powerful in the public imagination. Interpretation. People are reanalyzing moments where Harry speaks about manipulation, about control, about being led away from everything he knew, about waking up years later and realizing the cost was higher than he imagined. And when those reflections collide with long-standing rumors about social circles, about behavior, about loyalty, the internet does what it always does. It connects dots, sometimes fairly, sometimes recklessly, but always loudly. So why are these rumors resurfacing now? Because Harry's tone has changed. Earlier interviews were fiery, defensive, combative. Later interviews feel slower, heavier, almost tired. Listen closely, and you hear something else. Contradiction. He says he's happier, but speaks constantly about pain. He says he's free, but describes deep isolation. He says he has no regrets, yet revisits the same losses again and again. And that contradiction has fueled a dangerous but fascinating question. Is he trying to tell the truth, or trying to convince himself? This is where the most controversial interpretation enters the conversation. Some viewers believe Harry has, in his own way, already confirmed the worst rumors, not through direct accusation, but through emotional admission. When he talks about betrayal, people ask, betrayal by whom? When he talks about being cut off from family, people ask, who made that inevitable? When he talks about realizing too late that warning signs existed, people ask, what warning signs? And when he describes feeling trapped inside a narrative he didn't fully control, people wonder whether the fairy tale was ever mutual. Now add another layer. Silence. Meghan rarely responds directly to rumors. Strategically, that's often smart. But silence is not neutral. Silence invites interpretation. And the more Harry speaks alone, without her beside him, the more viewers scrutinize his expressions, his phrasing, his emotional slips. This has led to one of the most provocative interpretations circulating online today, that Harry, intentionally or not, is laying the groundwork for something bigger. Not a divorce announcement, not a public accusation, but a quiet repositioning of responsibility. Instead of blaming the palace, instead of blaming the press, instead of blaming the system, he's talking about choices. His choices, and the people who influence them. This doesn't prove wrongdoing. It doesn't confirm infidelity. It doesn't establish guilt. But it does something arguably more dangerous. It makes people reevaluate everything they thought they understood. And that's why this story refuses to die. Because once a narrative shifts from external enemies to internal decisions, the spotlight turns sharper. And when it does, old rumors suddenly feel relevant again. Who introduced whom? Who encouraged separation? Who benefited from isolation? Who lost the most? And most importantly, who changed after the wedding? And who didn't? This is not a story about villains and heroes. It's a story about power dynamics inside love, about identity loss, about what happens when one person abandons everything familiar for someone else, and then realizes there's no way back. And the reason people believe Harry is finally confirming something is not because of a single quote. It's because the emotional math no longer adds up. You don't sound this wounded if everything is fine. You don't keep circling the same regrets if there's nothing unresolved. You don't talk about freedom this much if you actually feel free. So what are we really witnessing? A man processing grief in public? A husband realizing too late what he gave up? Or someone slowly preparing the world for a truth he's not ready to say outright? That's what we're unpacking tonight. Not gossip, not hate, but patterns. Because patterns don't scream. They whisper. And if you listen closely to Harry's words over the years, the whispers are getting louder. But the moment that truly changed everything, the moment that made people stop and say, wait, did he just admit something without meaning to? That moment didn't happen in a tabloid. It happened in an interview that most people overlooked. A sentence that sounded harmless at the time. A reflection that felt emotional, but vague. Until now. Because once you hear it again, knowing everything that followed, it sounds less like reflection and more like confession. And that brings us to the beginning of the story itself. The speed, the intensity, the urgency. Because before the rumors, before the fallout, before the alleged admissions, there was a relationship that moved so fast, so fiercely, that no one had time to ask the most important question of all. What happens if this goes wrong? But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What if the warning signs weren't hidden at all? What if they were obvious, public, and even celebrated, right from the start? Because when people look back now, the first thing they notice isn't the wedding. It isn't the headlines. It isn't the exit. It's the speed. Blink and you miss it speed. One moment, the world barely knew her name. The next, she was standing beside Prince Harry, framed as destiny. And at the time, that speed felt romantic. Urgency was framed as passion. Intensity was framed as certainty. Isolation was framed as protection. But ask yourself something honestly. When has moving fast ever made something complicated simpler? The early narrative was clean and intoxicating. Harry, long painted as the restless royal, the spare who never quite fit the mold, had finally found someone who understood him. Someone outside the system. Someone who didn't care about titles, protocol, or history. That was the story, and the world wanted to believe it. Because Harry had always been the prince people felt sorry for. The boy who walked behind a coffin. The man who never seemed fully at ease in palaces that were never really home. So when Meghan Markle entered the picture, it felt like a rescue. For him, for her, for the idea of modern royalty itself. But even back then, there were questions. Quiet ones. Dismissed ones. Questions about why friends were cut off so quickly. Why long-standing relationships suddenly faded. Why everything seemed to narrow, fast, around one person. And those questions were brushed away with a single explanation. Love. Love explains everything, right? Except love doesn't usually demand speed like this. Within months, the relationship had escalated from private to permanent. Engagement announcements followed quickly. Plans accelerated. Decisions that would normally take years were made in weeks. And Harry didn't just move fast. He burned bridges behind him. That's not an accusation. That's observable. Friends who once spoke openly about him went silent. Advisors who had guided him for years were no longer present. Family dynamics shifted almost immediately, and not in subtle ways. At the time, critics were told they were being unfair, that they didn't understand what it was like to be in love under a microscope. That Harry was finally choosing happiness. But happiness doesn't usually look like urgency mixed with defensiveness. Listen carefully to those early interviews again. Harry isn't calm. He isn't grounded. He's intense, protective, almost bracing for impact. Why? If everything is perfect, why does it feel like a battle stance? And this is where hindsight becomes dangerous. Because now, people are rewatching those moments with new ears. They hear a man not just in love, but afraid of losing it. A man convinced this is his only chance. A man willing to gamble everything for certainty. That's not romance. That's risk. And when you build a life on risk, you rarely stop to count the cost until it's too late. The fairy tale framing also created another problem. It removed nuance. Anyone who raised concerns wasn't just questioning a relationship. They were questioning Harry's happiness. And that made any skepticism feel cruel. So people stayed quiet, even when they noticed changes. Harry's humor shifted. His ease disappeared. His world narrowed. And the faster things moved, the harder it became to slow them down. Because slowing down would mean admitting uncertainty. And uncertainty was the one thing Harry couldn't afford. Why? Because this wasn't just a relationship. It was a statement. Against the palace. Against the press. Against the life he'd grown to resent. If this didn't work, what did that say about every sacrifice he made to protect it? This is where the story becomes less about romance and more about psychology. When someone believes they've found the answer to years of pain, they don't question it. They defend it, relentlessly. And that defense becomes identity. Harry wasn't just defending Meghan. He was defending his choice, his rebellion, his escape, which explains why early criticism didn't just upset him, it enraged him. Every question felt like an attack. Every concern felt like sabotage. And slowly, subtly, a pattern emerged. Us versus them. The palace became the enemy. The press became the villain. And anyone who didn't fully support the relationship was grouped into that opposition. That's a powerful dynamic. Because once a couple defines the world that way, compromise becomes betrayal. Now think about this carefully. What happens when one person is the bridge between you and everyone else? And that bridge becomes the only path you walk. You become dependent. Emotionally. Socially. Narratively. And dependency doesn't have to be intentional to be dangerous. It just has to exist. This is why the speed matters so much in retrospect. Because moving fast didn't allow space for adjustment, for disagreement, for second thoughts. There was no pause to ask, is this sustainable? There was only momentum. And momentum doesn't stop easily, especially when the stakes are this high. A royal title, global attention, a centuries-old institution. All of it wrapped around a relationship that barely had time to breathe. Ask yourself this. If someone you love told you they were about to give up their family, their country, their identity, for a relationship that was less than 2 years old, would you celebrate or worry? At the time, worry was treated as cruelty. Now, worry feels prophetic. Because as the fairy tale advanced, the cracks didn't disappear. They multiplied. Public disagreements with the family. Private reports of tension behind palace walls. A sense that everything was happening too fast to control. And Harry's language began to shift. He started speaking less like a prince in love and more like a man under siege. Words like protection. Words like survival. Words like escape. Love stories don't usually sound like survival stories. Unless something feels threatening. And here's where the most uncomfortable question arises. Was Harry protecting Meghan from the world? Or protecting the relationship from scrutiny? Because those are not the same thing. And if scrutiny had slowed things down, would different choices have been made? We'll never know. But what we do know is this. The fairy tale didn't just move fast. It locked in. Once the wedding happened, there was no graceful exit. No easy recalibration. No neutral ground. Everything that followed had to justify what came before. And that's a dangerous place to live. Because when problems appear, and they always do, the instinct isn't to reassess. It's to double down. And doubling down has consequences, especially when the cost isn't just personal happiness, but family bonds, public trust, and a sense of self that took decades to build. This is why people now look back at the beginning and say, that's where it started. Not with rumors, not with accusations, not with betrayal, but with speed. Speed that felt romantic, speed that felt necessary, speed that felt unstoppable. And once you're moving that fast, stopping feels like failure. So you don't stop. You push forward. Even when the warning signs get louder. Even when the isolation deepens. Even when the story you're living no longer feels like the story you were promised. Because by then, turning back feels impossible. And that's what makes what comes next so unsettling. Because after the fairy tale locked in, after the world was divided into allies and enemies, after Harry had burned bridges he could never fully rebuild, something shifted. Not publicly at first, not dramatically, but internally. A shift in tone, a shift in energy, a shift in the way Harry spoke about his life. And the people closest to the story say that shift didn't begin after the royal exit. It began before, behind closed doors, away from cameras, in moments that never made headlines. Moments that would eventually fuel the rumors we're unpacking now. And once those rumors started circulating, quietly, persistently, they didn't target the palace. They targeted the relationship itself. But what came next wasn't speculation. It was silence. And silence, in this story, would prove far louder than any headline. What happens when the place that once felt like protection starts to feel like a cage? Because silence didn't arrive with a bang. It crept in, after the speed, after the celebrations, after the world decided this love story was unstoppable. The silence began quietly, in rooms without cameras. And once it arrived, everything changed. At first, nothing looked wrong from the outside. The smiles were still there. The public appearances still happened. The headlines still spoke of progress, of modernity, of a new chapter for the monarchy. But listen closely to the people who watched from inside. They don't talk about arguments. They don't talk about shouting matches. They talk about atmosphere. Tension you could feel when someone entered a room. Pauses where conversation used to flow. Eyes darting before words were spoken. And that's important. Because real divides don't announce themselves. They settle in. The palace, for Harry, had always been complicated. He loved parts of it, hated others. But it was familiar. It was family. It was the structure that raised him, even if it sometimes suffocated him. What changed wasn't the palace itself. It was how he experienced it. Suddenly, everything felt interpreted through a new lens. Tradition felt like judgment. Protocol felt like control. Advice felt like interference. And once that lens took hold, even neutral actions felt hostile. Imagine this for a moment. You walk into a place you've known your entire life. But now, the person beside you experiences it as foreign, cold, and threatening. Every glance feels loaded. Every rule feels personal. What do? You choose sides. And Harry chose his. Publicly, he framed it as protection. Privately, people describe it as withdrawal. Meetings shortened. Conversations avoided. Long-standing advisors quietly removed from his orbit. Not because they were cruel. Not because they were incompetent. But because they belonged to a world he was learning to distrust. And that distrust didn't stop at staff. It reached family. Small misunderstandings turned into emotional landmines. Differences in approach became moral disagreements. And every attempt to intervene was reframed as an attack. This is where the story stops being about a palace and starts being about isolation. Because isolation doesn't always look like loneliness. Sometimes it looks like loyalty. Harry didn't see himself pulling away. He saw himself standing firm. And the more people expressed concern, the more convinced he became that concern itself was the problem. That's a dangerous loop. Because once concern equals hostility, there's no room for nuance. And according to multiple reported accounts, that's exactly what happened. Harry began to believe that the institution wasn't just failing him. It was actively hurting the person he loved. Now pause here. Ask yourself something uncomfortable. When someone you love feels attacked by your family, do you slow things down to investigate? Or do you act quickly to shield them? Most people choose the shield. And Harry did too. But shielding came at a cost. Suddenly, family gatherings felt strained. Casual interactions became formal. Unspoken tension replaced easy familiarity. And the palace noticed. Not because they were spying, but because when someone changes this drastically, it's impossible to ignore. The prince who once navigated royal life with humor and charm now seemed guarded, defensive, less open to dialogue. Everyone believed they were the victim, and when everyone feels attacked, no one listens. This is also where Harry's public tone begins to change in subtle ways. He speaks less about shared joy and more about personal struggle, less about partnership and more about battle. He talks about needing to escape, about breaking cycles, about protecting his mental health at all costs. Those words resonated deeply with audiences, but they also raise questions. Why does someone who just married for love sound like someone preparing for war? And here's the contradiction that viewers are now re-examining. Harry says he found peace, but his life looks increasingly chaotic. He says he found clarity, but his relationships grow more fractured. He says he found freedom, but his world becomes smaller. Freedom usually expands a life. This looked like contraction, and the palace, for all its flaws, wasn't blind to that. Concerns were raised. Suggestions offered. Slowing down was encouraged, and those suggestions were reportedly not well received. Because slowing down would mean acknowledging that something wasn't right, and acknowledging that would threaten the narrative everything depended on. So instead, distance increased. Harry appeared less at ease around his family, more guarded, more distant, and the silence hardened. This is the moment many observers point to as the true turning point. Not the wedding, not the media backlash, not the eventual exit, but the quiet emotional separation that happened first. Once Harry emotionally left the palace, the physical departure was inevitable, because you don't walk away from a place you still feel connected to. You walk away when it no longer feels safe. And safety, in this story, became subjective. What Harry felt was protection, others experienced as exclusion. What Harry felt was loyalty, others experienced as rejection. And that difference in perception is where families break. Now think about what that does to a person internally. You're told your family doesn't understand you. You're told the institution is toxic. You're told that stepping away is the only way to survive. Even if parts of you still love that world, that creates grief. But grief doesn't always show up as sadness. Sometimes it shows up as anger, and sometimes it shows up as silence. Harry didn't explode publicly at first. He withdrew. And withdrawal is often mistaken for strength, but it's usually a sign of unresolved pain. This is why the palace divide matters so much to the rumors we're discussing. Because once Harry distanced himself from his family, the protective buffer disappeared. No advisors to challenge narratives. No relatives to question decisions. No long-standing relationships to ground him. Everything filtered through a single perspective. And when that happens, any rumor, fair or unfair, finds fertile ground. Which brings us to the most dangerous phase of this story. The moment when silence stopped being neutral and started being interpreted as confirmation. Because once Harry stopped correcting certain narratives, people filled in the gaps themselves. And the internet doesn't fill gaps gently. It fills them with extremes. Allegations multiplied. Motives were assigned. Intentions were assumed. And while Harry remained mostly quiet, his silence was no longer seen as dignity. It was seen as avoidance. And avoidance invites suspicion, especially when paired with emotional interviews that hinted at regret without naming it. This is when viewers began asking the question no one had dared to ask before. What if the palace wasn't the only problem? What if the real fracture happened inside the relationship itself, and the palace was just the first casualty? That question didn't dominate headlines yet, but it was forming, quietly, persistently, and it would soon explode into something much bigger. Because as the palace doors closed, the spotlight shifted, from institution to intimacy. And once attention turned inward, the rumors we've been circling began to take on a different weight. But before those rumors went public, there was one final moment of silence. A moment where Harry could have clarified everything, and didn't. And that silence would haunt him later. Because what came next wasn't just a divide. It was a departure. And once he walked away, there was no turning back. What if the confession didn't come as a confession at all? What if it slipped through the cracks of ordinary conversation, hidden inside interviews that were meant to explain everything, but ended up revealing far more than intended? Because this chapter doesn't begin with a scandal. It begins with a sentence. A sentence that, at the time, sounded thoughtful, reasonable, even compassionate. But years later, People hear it again and feel something shift in their stomach. Have you ever replayed something you once said and thought, why did I phrase it like that? That's what's happening now. Across interviews, podcasts, sit-downs, documentaries, and reflective moments, Harry has spoken often, more often than many expected. He's explained his choices. He's defended his actions. He's unpacked his pain. But in doing so, he's left a trail, not of facts, of feelings. And feelings don't lie the way facts sometimes do. Early on, his interviews were fiery. He spoke fast. He interrupted himself. He sounded certain. Conviction poured out of him like adrenaline. The message was clear. This was necessary. This was survival. This was the only way. But then something changed. The pace slowed. His voice softened. The certainty wavered. And the explanations grew longer. That's when people began to notice the contradictions. He would say he had no regrets, then spend 20 minutes describing everything he'd lost. He would say he felt free, then describe living under constant emotional strain. He would say he was protecting his family, then talk about being profoundly lonely. Loneliness isn't usually the language of freedom, and viewers picked up on it. At first, only a few commented, then a few more. Then suddenly, entire threads appeared online breaking down his interviews line by line. Not maliciously at first. Curiously, what did he mean when he said that? Why did he pause there? Why did he smile when talking about pain, but stiffen when talking about home? These aren't courtroom questions. They're human ones. Because humans instinctively sense when something doesn't align. Take one example that's been replayed endlessly. Harry speaks about realizing too late that warning signs existed. At the time, most viewers assumed he meant warning signs about the press, about the palace, about institutional cruelty. But listen again. He doesn't specify. He just says warning signs. And then he goes quiet. No clarification. No elaboration. Just a pause. Pauses matter. There where thoughts collide. Another moment that's now under scrutiny involves his repeated use of the phrase, I didn't know how bad it would get. Bad for whom? For the family? For the relationship? For himself? The ambiguity is striking. Because if the problem were external, clarity would be easy. You name the enemy. You describe the threat. You assign blame. But Harry doesn't always do that anymore. Instead, he speaks in reflections. Hindsight language. The kind of language people use when they're reprocessing something painful. And that's what unsettles audiences. Because reprocessing implies unresolved conflict, not victory. Another moment people now question is how often Harry uses the phrase, I was convinced. Convinced is not the same as certain. Convinced suggests persuasion, influence, momentum. Why not say I knew? Why say I believed? Words matter, especially when someone has had years to refine their message. And then there are the moments when he talks about his family, not the palace, not the institution, but his blood relatives. The tone there is different. Less anger, more sadness, more distance. He doesn't sound triumphant. He sounds like someone who misses something he can't admit he misses. And when people asked him directly about reconciliation, his answers became even more careful. Not dismissive, not hostile. Careful. Careful answers are often the most revealing. Because they're designed to avoid saying the wrong thing. And that raises a question. What is the wrong thing? Is it admitting regret? Is it admitting influence? Is it admitting that the story he told himself might not be the full story anymore? Here's where things get complicated. None of this proves betrayal. None of this confirms rumors. None of this establishes guilt. But it does reveal emotional tension. And emotional tension, when paired with years of unresolved rumors, creates a narrative vacuum. Into that vacuum, speculation rushes. People began to ask, what if Harry's interviews aren't explanations, but confessions in disguise? Not confessions of actions, confessions of realization. The realization that life didn't turn out the way he expected, that the sacrifices were heavier than promised, that the isolation cut deeper than anticipated. And when people experience that kind of realization, they often look for meaning. Who influenced me? Why didn't I slow down? Why didn't I listen? Those questions don't always get asked out loud, but they shape everything that follows. Another detail that caught viewers' attention is how often Harry refers to himself as being led through certain decisions. Led to therapy, led to awareness, led to understanding. Being led isn't inherently negative, but it implies direction. And when someone repeatedly describes themselves as being guided rather than choosing, it raises questions about agency. Was he choosing freely? Or was he following a path laid out quickly and convincingly? Again, this is interpretation. But interpretation is powerful, because interpretation changes how every earlier moment is understood. Suddenly, early defensiveness looks less like confidence and more like insecurity. Early urgency looks less like passion and more like fear of doubt. And early silence looks less like dignity and more like suppression. One of the most talked about moments comes from a casual exchange that wasn't meant to be controversial at all. Harry mentions that he didn't feel like himself for a long time. Think about that. Not that he was stressed, not that he was unhappy, but that he wasn't himself. That's identity language. And identity loss doesn't happen overnight. It happens when someone's world narrows to a single axis, a single perspective, a single mission, a single relationship. When everything else becomes background noise. People who've experienced that recognize it immediately. And when they hear Harry speak that way, they don't hear blame. They hear mourning. Mourning for the person he used to be. This is why so many listeners now describe his interviews as sad rather than defiant. The anger has softened. What remains is heaviness. And heaviness invites reinterpretation. It invites people to go back to the beginning and ask, where did this start? Was it the palace? Was it the press? Or was it the dynamic inside the relationship itself? These questions gained momentum when Harry stopped doing something important, correcting narratives. Early on, he was quick to respond, quick to clarify, quick to defend. But in later years, certain rumors went unaddressed. And while silence can be strategic, it can also be read as fatigue, or resignation, or acceptance that correcting everything is impossible. But here's the catch. When you don't correct a damaging interpretation, you allow it to grow. And some of the most damaging interpretations weren't about the palace. They were about personal betrayal. Again, there is no verified admission, no confirmed allegation. But the emotional breadcrumbs made people wonder. If the rumors were entirely false, why not shut them down clearly? Why allow ambiguity where clarity could protect everyone involved? That question lingers. And then there's the moment many fans point to as the turning point. A quiet, reflective comment about realizing that not everyone who claims to want the best for you actually does. That line alone launched thousands of interpretations. Who was he talking about? The media? The institution? Friends? Or someone much closer? He never specified. And that lack of specificity changed everything. Because when you leave a statement open-ended, people fill it with their own fears. And the most common fear people project onto this story is betrayal. Not necessarily physical betrayal, but emotional betrayal. The sense of being pulled away from one's roots under the promise of something better, and then realizing the cost was irreversible. This is why the words sound different now, because context has changed. At the time, those interviews felt like justification. Now, they feel like processing. And processing means the story isn't finished. It means the narrator is still figuring out what the story actually was. That's uncomfortable, especially when millions of people feel invested in how it ends. So where does that leave us? With a man whose public words no longer sound like certainty, but like reflection. With a story that no longer feels clean, but complex. And with a growing sense that the truth, whatever it is, hasn't fully surfaced yet. Because people don't revisit the same pain over and over unless it's unresolved. They don't circle the same themes unless something still weighs on them. And they don't speak this carefully unless there's something they're afraid to say wrong. Which brings us to the next phase of this story. Because while Harry's words were being reinterpreted, something else was happening at the same time. Rumors that once lived on the fringes started creeping toward the center. Not because they were proven, but because the silence around them grew louder. And when silence meets suspicion, the result is explosive. But the most dangerous rumors didn't come from strangers. They came from people who claimed to know what was happening behind closed doors. And once insiders allegedly started talking, even indirectly, the story took on a life of its own. What happens when a rumor survives not because it's loud, but because no one shuts it down? Because silence doesn't just leave space. It creates meaning. By the time the palace divide was obvious and Harry's interviews were being replayed with new ears, the rumor ecosystem had already changed. This wasn't the early phase anymore, where speculation lived on message boards and anonymous accounts. This was the stage where whispers began to echo, not shouted, repeated, and repetition is how rumors gain gravity. The most striking thing wasn't what was being said. It was what wasn't being addressed. Certain stories would break, burn for a few days, then disappear. Others, however, lingered. They resurfaced months later, then again a year later. Each time slightly reshaped, slightly more confident, slightly harder to dismiss. And the palace didn't engage. No clarifications, no firm denials, no behind-the-scenes briefings to kill the narrative. Nothing. Now, historically, royal silence isn't unusual. The institution often believes responding gives oxygen to speculation. Ignore it, and it dies. But here's the problem. These rumors didn't die. They adapted. They shifted focus away from the institution and toward something far more personal. Character, loyalty, influence. And once a rumor shifts from policy to personality, ignoring it becomes dangerous. Because people don't expect institutions to respond emotionally. They expect individuals to. And the absence of response began to feel intentional. Ask yourself this. If a rumor is entirely baseless and deeply damaging, why not shut it down once, clearly, and move on? Why allow it to keep resurfacing? The answer could be strategy. It could be fatigue. It could be legal caution. But to the public, it felt like something else. Avoidance. And avoidance invites imagination. These weren't just tabloid inventions anymore. They were stories allegedly sourced to people who claimed proximity. Former acquaintances. Social circles. Friends of friends. Always just distant enough to avoid accountability, but always close enough to feel plausible. Some rumors focused on behavior before the marriage. Others focused on dynamics during it. Others hinted at emotional entanglements, not affairs, but influence. Influence is harder to disprove, because influence doesn't leave evidence. It leaves outcomes. And people began pointing to outcomes. Harry isolated from family. Harry estranged from lifelong friends. Harry relocated across the world. Harry redefining his identity almost entirely. They asked, did all of this really come from his own instincts alone? Again, that question does not accuse. It interrogates. And interrogation is uncomfortable. This is also where timing matters. These rumors didn't explode during the honeymoon phase. They grew louder as Harry's tone softened and his confidence appeared to fracture. When someone is thriving, rumors bounce off them. When someone looks conflicted, rumors stick. And Harry looked conflicted. Not miserable, not defeated, but heavy. And heaviness changes how people interpret silence. The palace, meanwhile, stayed unmoved. They issued statements on procedural issues, on media corrections, on formal matters. But on the most personal allegations, they remained distant. That distance was interpreted in two opposing ways. Supporters saw it as restraint. Critics saw it as confirmation. Neither interpretation was provable, but both spread. And once narratives split, truth becomes secondary to belief. This is also where people began to notice inconsistencies in what was addressed and what wasn't. Certain false stories were corrected swiftly. Others were allowed to linger. Why those? Why not these? No one outside the institution knows. But humans are pattern-seeking creatures. And when they see selective silence, they assume selective discomfort. Now let's slow this down. Rumors don't damage reputations on their own. What damages reputations is alignment. When rumors align with visible behavior, people start treating them as explanations rather than fiction. Harry's visible behavior included a shrinking inner circle, a growing defensiveness, a repeated emphasis on being saved or awakened, a sense of regret without clear attribution. That alignment gave rumors traction, not proof, traction. And once traction exists, silence feels louder than denial. This is also where a new type of rumor emerged. Not about actions, but about dynamics. Who dominated conversations? Who set boundaries? Who defined enemies? These questions are subtle. They don't accuse anyone of crimes or moral failures. They ask about power. And power dynamics inside relationships are notoriously hard to discuss publicly, because even acknowledging them opens the door to interpretation. So again, silence prevailed. But silence has consequences. Because the longer these dynamics went unaddressed, the more people began to project motives. Some projected ambition. Others projected insecurity. Others projected manipulation. Projection doesn't require evidence. It requires narrative fit. And this narrative fit uncomfortably well with the visible outcomes. Now consider Harry's position. If he denied rumors outright, he risked undermining the story he had already told about protection, unity, and loyalty. If he stayed silent, he allowed speculation to grow. Neither option was clean, and that's often how people get trapped, not by lies. How does someone go from deeply embedded in a lifelong support system to almost entirely separated from it? How does that shift occur without at least some internal resistance? And if there was resistance, how was it resolved? Those questions led people behind the metaphorical doors. Behind closed doors doesn't mean secrecy. It means patterns that aren't meant for public consumption. Patterns like who speaks first, who frames decisions, who defines threats, who sets boundaries. In healthy relationships, those roles move fluidly. In strained ones, they calcify. According to people who have spoken indirectly about the dynamic, decision-making became increasingly centralized. Not in a dramatic, authoritarian way, in a persuasive one. Framed as care, framed as protection, framed as necessity. Think about how powerful that framing is. If someone tells you, this is for your own good, it doesn't feel like control. It feels like love. And if you already believe the world is hostile, that framing becomes irresistible. Harry, by his own admission, felt under constant attack. From the press, from expectations, from history. So when solutions were offered, move away, cut ties, redefine identity, they didn't feel extreme. They felt logical. But logic inside emotional pressure doesn't always lead to balance. It leads to acceleration. And acceleration is dangerous when it's one-sided. Observers claim that dissent became difficult. Not forbidden, not punished, but discouraged. Concerns were reframed as negativity. Questions were reframed as lack of loyalty. Hesitation was reframed as fear. And again, this does not prove manipulation, but it describes influence. Influence that becomes stronger when one partner feels disempowered by the outside world. Harry had already spent years feeling misunderstood. So when someone validated his pain and offered a clear narrative, this is why you hurt, this is who's responsible, this is how you fix it, it felt clarifying. But clarity can be intoxicating. Because real life is messy, clarity promises simplicity. And simplicity is seductive when you're overwhelmed. Those same sources describe a gradual shift in how Harry spoke privately about his family. Not rage, disappointment. And disappointment is more dangerous than anger. Anger can be released. Disappointment settles. He began framing family interactions as draining, as emotionally costly, as obstacles to healing. That language matters. Because once people are framed as obstacles, distance becomes a solution. And distance, once normalized, becomes permanent. This is where people believe the dynamic crossed a line. Not into abuse, not into betrayal, but into imbalance. Where one worldview began to dominate the emotional environment. And when one worldview dominates, alternatives disappear. That's when rumors about control gain momentum. Not because people believed someone was evil, but because the outcome looked lopsided. One partner gained clarity, purpose, and narrative power. The other lost roots, relationships, and identity. Again, outcome does not prove intent, but outcome shapes interpretation. And interpretation, once widespread, becomes reality in the public mind. There's another aspect people point to when discussing behind closed doors dynamics. Emotional labor. Who was responsible for maintaining stability? Who absorbed anxiety? Who adjusted to keep the peace? Some claim Harry became increasingly reactive, hyper-aware of threats, criticism, and perceived slights. And that reactivity required management. Management doesn't sound sinister, but it requires energy. And when one person is constantly managing another's emotional state, power shifts. Not overtly, subtly, because the person being managed begins to feel dependent. Dependent on reassurance. Dependent on validation. Dependent on direction. That dependence doesn't have to be intentional to be consequential. It just has to exist. This is why people now reinterpret Harry's statements about being guided, or shown, or helped to see. Those phrases once sounded like growth. Now, some hear them as evidence of reliance. Again, interpretation. But interpretation grounded in pattern. Another pattern that raised eyebrows was the speed with which boundaries hardened. Friends who expressed concern weren't debated with. They were distanced from. Family members who questioned choices weren't engaged, they were categorized. And categorization is powerful, because once someone is placed in a category, unsupportive, toxic, unsafe, the relationship becomes conditional. You can only stay if you agree. An agreement, over time, stops being voluntary. It becomes a prerequisite. Now, imagine being Harry in that environment. Your life has always been public. Your pain has always been consumed. Your mistakes have always been amplified. And now, finally, you have a narrative that explains everything. The press is cruel. The institution is rigid. Distance is healing. That narrative simplifies your world, but it also limits it. Because once you adopt a narrative that explains everything, you stop questioning it. And when you stop questioning, you stop noticing costs. Costs like loneliness, like regret, like the slow erosion of familiar bonds. Those costs don't show up immediately. They surface later, usually after the momentum slows. And that's when reflection begins. This is where people believe the story turned inward. Not publicly yet. Privately, Harry reportedly began expressing exhaustion. Not physical exhaustion. Emotional. The kind that comes from holding one story together against mounting internal contradictions. You can only insist you're happier for so long before your tone betrays you. And betrayal of tone is what audiences noticed first. He sounded tired. Not relieved. Not triumphant. Tired. And tired people reevaluate. They replay decisions. They revisit turning points. They ask questions they didn't allow themselves to ask before. Like, what did I give up? Like, was this the only path? Like, why does this still hurt? These questions don't require an external villain. They require honesty. And honesty is dangerous when your entire public identity depends on certainty. This is why the behind closed doors dynamic matters so much. Because it suggests the story isn't about scandal. It's about imbalance. About what happens when one person's emotional reality becomes the framework for an entire life. And what happens when that framework starts to crack. People close to the situation suggest that private moments of doubt were increasingly reframed as weakness. Not deliberately, not cruelly, but consistently. Doubt didn't fit the narrative, so it was minimized. And minimizing doubt doesn't eliminate it. It buries it. Until it surfaces in other ways. In tone, in hesitation, in interviews that sound reflective instead of resolute. That's where we are now. Watching the residue of buried doubt surface slowly, publicly, without ever being named directly. And that's why the rumors evolved. They stopped being about wrongdoing. They became about regret. Regret for choices made too quickly. Regret for bridges burned too decisively. Regret for a life narrowed around a single axis. And when regret enters the conversation, blame inevitably follows. Not outward blame. Internal blame. Who influenced me? Who did I listen to? Why didn't I pause? Those questions don't accuse anyone else. They accuse the self. But when the self is intertwined with another person, separation becomes complicated. Because acknowledging influence can feel like accusing the person you love. And that's a line most people avoid crossing publicly. So instead, they speak indirectly. In reflections. In lessons. In statements about growth and awakening. And audiences, sensing the indirectness, read between the lines. Sometimes unfairly. Sometimes insightfully. But always intensely. This is why Chapter 5 matters. Because it reframes the story away from sensationalism and toward psychology. Away from scandal and toward consequence. And consequences don't care about intent. They exist regardless. Which brings us to the next phase of this story. Because once private dynamics came under scrutiny, the rumors didn't escalate quietly. They sharpened. They narrowed. They focused on one allegation above all others. Not because it was proven, but because it was emotionally devastating. The allegation of betrayal. Not necessarily physical, but relational. The idea that Harry gave everything and received something very different in return. And once that idea took hold, the narrative crossed a point of no return. Because betrayal, even implied, changes how every past moment is interpreted. And that's where we're going next. What happens when a rumor crosses the line from uncomfortable to unbearable? Because this is the chapter people argue about the most. Not because it's proven, not because it's documented, but because once it entered the conversation, it changed how everything else was interpreted. This is the moment when whispers stopped being abstract and became personal. By the time the public began seriously re-examining Harry's interviews, a particular allegation had already been circulating quietly for years. It didn't dominate headlines at first. It lived in side comments, anonymous posts, vague references. Never detailed, never specific. Always framed as things people were saying. And that's important, because the power of this allegation was never in evidence. It was an implication. The implication that something about loyalty, trust, or exclusivity inside the relationship was not as clean as the fairy tale suggested. Not proven infidelity, not confirmed betrayal, but doubt. And doubt is corrosive. The earliest versions of this rumor didn't even name actions. They focused on proximity. Who was around? Who had access? Who seemed unusually close? And in the age of social media, proximity is enough to spark a narrative. A photograph becomes a theory. A friendship becomes a question mark. Silence becomes suspicion. This is how damaging stories are born without ever being stated directly. People didn't say, "This happened." They said, "Why does this look like this?" And once enough people ask the same question, the question becomes the story. Now pause here, because this distinction matters. No credible source has ever produced evidence of wrongdoing. No confirmed admission exists. No verified timeline supports the most extreme claims. That's not opinion. That's fact. But rumors don't need proof to spread. They need emotional plausibility. And by this point, emotional plausibility was everywhere. Harry sounded conflicted. The relationship looked strained. The isolation felt real. So when rumors emerged that hinted at betrayal, people didn't ask for evidence. They asked whether it felt possible. And for many, it did. Why? Because the story had already shifted from triumph to sacrifice. When someone gives up family, identity, and homeland for love, audiences expect that love to be unwavering. Perfect, even. So the idea that it might not be, that it might be complicated, imperfect, or asymmetrical, felt shocking. And shock fuels obsession. Here's where things get even more complex. Some versions of the rumor weren't about physical behavior at all. They were about emotional boundaries. Who shared what with whom? Who relied on whom? Who became central? Emotional closeness can be interpreted as betrayal when relationships are under strain, especially when one partner already feels they've lost everything else. And this is where Harry's words come back into focus. When he talks about feeling misled, when he talks about realizing too late that not everyone had his best interests at heart, when he talks about trust being fragile, he never names anyone. But audiences fill in the blanks, sometimes unfairly, sometimes instinctively. This is the danger of ambiguity. Ambiguity invites projection. And the more Harry spoke in lessons instead of specifics, the more people projected the most dramatic explanations possible. Now let's address the most extreme version of the allegation head-on, carefully. Claims about multiple partners, affairs, or secret relationships have never been substantiated. They exist only as rumors. And responsible storytelling requires that distinction to be clear. But the reason these claims gain traction has less to do with sex and more to do with imbalance. People didn't focus on alleged acts. They focused on perceived power. Who had options? Who had leverage? Who seemed emotionally in control? In public narratives, Harry increasingly appeared vulnerable. Open, raw, searching. And vulnerability changes how rumors land. If he had appeared confident and grounded, these allegations might have faded. Instead, his vulnerability gave them emotional weight. Viewers asked, could someone this exposed also be blindsided? That question doesn't accuse anyone, but it reframes the relationship. And reframing is enough to destabilize perception. Another reason the rumors spread is because they seemed to explain something that hadn't been explained yet. Why the exhaustion? Why the sadness? Why the constant reflection? People wanted a cause. And when no clear cause was named, they reached for the most dramatic one. That's human nature. We prefer painful explanations to unresolved ambiguity. Pain feels complete. Ambiguity feels endless. So even without evidence, the betrayal narrative gained momentum. Not because people wanted to believe the worst, but because it gave shape to confusion. And once that narrative existed, everything else was filtered through it. Harry's pauses became suspicion. His silences became confirmation. His sadness became proof. This is how rumors solidify into belief without ever crossing the threshold of fact. Now consider Harry's position again. If he denied the rumors forcefully, he would draw attention to them. If he ignored them, they would grow. If he addressed them vaguely, they would mutate. There was no clean exit. And so he did what many people do in impossible situations. He spoke around the pain. About trust. About healing. About learning. But not about the rumor itself. And in doing so, he allowed others to define it for him. That's when the narrative took its most dangerous turn. Because people stopped asking whether the rumor was true. They started asking whether Harry believed it was true. And that's a fundamentally different question. You don't need evidence for belief. You need emotion. And Harry's emotional state, his heaviness, his reflection, his repeated return to loss, made people wonder whether he was carrying something unspoken. Not anger. Not accusation. But disappointment. Disappointment is quiet. Disappointment doesn't explode. It lingers. And linger it did. This is why the rumor became the centerpiece of the story, even without substance. It matched the emotional tone of everything else. A man who gave everything. A life that didn't deliver the peace promised. A relationship that came at a cost no one anticipated. People layered the betrayal narrative on top of that story because it fit emotionally. Not factually. Emotionally. And that distinction is what keeps this story alive. Because emotions don't resolve neatly. They echo. Harry's later interviews echo confusion. Echo regret. Echo something unfinished. Not hatred. Something sadder. And sadness invites meaning. Which is why this allegation, more than any other, refuses to disappear. It's not about scandal. It's about fear. The fear that love, no matter how loudly defended, can still fail. The fear that sacrifice doesn't guarantee security. The fear that giving everything to one person can leave you with nothing if it unravels. Those fears are universal. And when a public figure embodies them, people project their own stories onto his. That's what happened here. Not proof. Not confession. Projection. And once projection takes over, truth becomes almost irrelevant. Because people don't argue facts anymore. They argue feelings. This is also why the rumor hurt so deeply. Not because it accused someone of wrongdoing, but because it threatened the moral foundation of the story itself. If the love story wasn't pure, then what was the sacrifice for? And that question terrifies people. So they chase answers, even imaginary ones. But here's the crucial turning point. The rumors didn't just stay in public discourse. They began affecting how people interpreted Harry's own behavior toward his family. Because if betrayal was possible in one relationship, what did that say about loyalty in others? And that's where the narrative expanded again. From marriage to family. From private doubt to public fracture. Which brings us to the next chapter. Because once betrayal entered the story, even as rumor, it reframed everything Harry said about losing his family. Suddenly, those losses weren't just collateral damage. They were evidence. And that interpretation would lead people to believe something even more explosive. That Harry wasn't just describing pain. He was assigning blame. Quietly. Indirectly. But unmistakably. And that belief would push the story into its most controversial phase yet. What if the most revealing changes weren't about love at all, but about who disappeared when no one was looking? Because while headlines focused on palaces and press wars, something quieter was happening in the background. People were vanishing. Not dramatically. Not publicly. They simply stopped being there. And when observers began mapping that absence, a pattern emerged that was impossible to ignore. Harry's world used to be wide. Old friends from school. Military brothers forged in shared risk. Advisors who knew his strengths and weaknesses. Family friends who had known him since childhood. This wasn't a man without support. So when that support evaporated, people asked why. At first, the explanation was straightforward. Life changes. Marriage shifts priorities. Distance happens. All true. But normal life changes don't usually result in near total replacement. And that's what caught attention. It wasn't that Harry lost a few friends. It was that almost everyone from his old world faded at once. And in their place appeared a new circle. Tighter. More curated. Less connected to his past. Observers didn't see bridges being maintained. They saw bridges being replaced. And replacement carries meaning. The friends who remained were often connected through a single channel. Introduced through a single source. Aligned around a single worldview. That doesn't make them bad people. But it does change the ecosystem. Because ecosystems thrive on diversity. When everyone agrees, nothing gets challenged. And when nothing gets challenged, narratives harden. Those close to Harry's former circle described something unsettling. Not hostility, not resentment, confusion. They didn't describe arguments or confrontations. They described unanswered messages. Shortened conversations. Polite distance where warmth once existed. And politeness, in this context, felt colder than anger. Because anger suggests conflict. Politeness suggests finality. This is where loyalties come into focus. When someone chooses a new life path, loyalties are tested. People expect some drift. But what unsettled observers was how quickly and completely old loyalties were deprioritized. Friends who expressed concern were reframed as unsupportive. Friends who asked questions were labeled negative. Friends who hesitated were quietly sidelined. And again, this framing didn't happen public.